this lecture, we're looking at Luther and his Reformation breakthrough. And Luther's Reformation and the breakthrough that he had is one of the most well-recognized and most important moments in the history of the church. So many folks are aware that Luther nailed 95 Theses to the door of the church at the castle there in Wittenberg, and that everything that flowed after it gave rise to the Protestant Reformation and subsequently all of the Protestant denominations that came thereafter. But sometimes things that are recognized are not well understood. They become too familiar to us. We get so used to the idea that Luther began the Reformation through a protest over maybe salvation, maybe indulgences, that it can be sometimes hard to understand what the Reformation and what Luther's breakthrough was really all about. And so we're going to talk about this here in this lecture. We're going to get a bit of a sense as to who Luther was and as to what his goals were, how he began the Reformation, and all of the events that flowed thereafter. And to begin, we have to look at Luther's life. Luther was a man from Germany. He was born into a middle-class family in the heart of modern-day Saxony, there in the middle part of modern-day Germany. And a great deal is made about Luther's background and his life. At times, there are those, whether in the historical studies world or in the popular level, who believe that Luther had something of a rough childhood. There are allegations that Luther's father was abusive, that he often was tyrannical over Luther, both in his discipline and in the way that he organized Luther's life. And the allegation here is that Luther's Reformation, his eventual rebellion against the authorities of the church, stem in part from the fact that he was really quite cross with his father, that he and his father did not get along, and that because of that, he developed something of an identity crisis as to who he really was. And therefore, when he entered the monastery, the angry father is quickly translated to become the angry, tyrannical God, who Luther has to impress with his works and with his righteousness. Well, the problem with all this, of course, is that it's a modern interpretation of Luther. Luther does, at a later date, and actually throughout his life, at times tell us a great number of things about the way that his parents were disciplinarians. Well, what happened is in the 1900s, a neo-Freudian scholar by the name of Erik Erikson compiled all of these comments and all that we know about the young man Luther and published it under that title, Young Man Luther. And Erikson alleges all kinds of things about Luther that had never been said before, namely that he was a man who suffered from one of Erikson's more popular theories, which is that of the identity crisis. Erikson believed that Luther is a prime candidate for a historical example of what he found in his modern research on identity, midlife crisis, and etc. Well, the problem here, as historians have noted again and again, is it really psychoanalyzes Luther in a way that he is not really intending us to psychoanalyze him. There is no evidence, for example, that Luther began the Reformation because he had a horrible relationship with his father. At times, Erikson mistranslates or misapplies or misinterprets texts from Luther on his life. So we can set aside the idea that Luther had a horrible childhood. He had a disciplinarian father, and Luther does tell us that his father, at times, was maybe a bit excessive. But as we'll see, Luther's Reformation was more about the medieval system that he was raised in as a monk than it was the family life that he was raised in as a child. Luther's father was a copper miner. He was a man, again, of middle-class income, at times approaching upper-middle-class income status. But in the end, he sometimes lost some of his profits and kind of lived right there in the middle of the income spectrum for his own day. He was a well-respected man, and having some extra capital, he wanted more for his son Martin than he had had himself. And so Martin got a good education. As a young boy, he was sent to what they call grammar school, which is where he would go and learn his Latin in preparation of joining the university. And he does. Eventually, he joins the University of Erfurt, a really sort of middle-level, up-and-coming university, not too far from his home area there in Saxony. And Luther was a good student. This is another one of the myths that's out there, is that Luther was a bit of a bumpkin, a bit of a redneck when it came to his education. In fact, he was really at the top of his class. In 1505, he eventually graduated with his master's in arts. Now, the way education worked in this day and age is you did your bachelor's and your master's in the arts in preparation, potentially at least, for some further study thereon in a special field. You could go into theology and Bible, you can go into law, into medicine, and into a number of other subjects. Well, the story as we know it is that Luther and his father had tentatively agreed that Luther would join the law faculty and that he would pursue a career in law. This had a number of prospects for career. Perhaps he could come back and work with the family estate and be a paragon along with his father as a lawyer there for the city. The horizon for Luther, in other words, was not all that small if he studied law. Well, fatefully, on July 2nd, 1505, after Luther had been home for a while after having completed his master's in arts, while riding on horseback back to law school to begin, Luther gets caught in a thunderstorm. And Luther tells us this story much later in his life, so there's a bit of a editorial hand at work here. But Luther tells us that he's caught in the thunderstorm. And in this day and age, to be caught in a thunderstorm was considered a bit of a bad omen. It's not that they considered lightning to be superstitious, but they knew that if you were struck by lightning, that you could very well die. And in the Middle Ages, to die suddenly like this was seen as divine judgment. To be struck down, either with a sudden illness, or in this case, to be struck by lightning and perish, would be some indication that God had been unhappy with you. Well, it's for this and a number of other reasons that Luther begins to really panic during the thunderstorm. And he tells us that he falls off of his horse and he makes a vow to St. Anne. And he calls out, "St. Anne, I will become a monk." Now, there's always an element of duplicity here that people have noticed. First and foremost, Anne as a saint was actually, believe it or not, the patron saint of minors. Now, this is a medieval practice. It's still in effect relatively in the same way today, in fact, in Catholic circles. And that is that a saint would be assigned to be the overwatcher or the protector and the one to whom you pray, depending on whatever circumstance you're in or whatever profession you follow. Well, St. Anne, as it turned out, was the patron saint of minors. And a lot of people have noticed that Luther here might very well be twisting his father's arm. He knows that if he vows to St. Anne that he'll become a monk, well, his father being a minor is not exactly going to back down and hack off the very saint that is in charge of protecting his own industry. But laying that aside, we're not quite sure if Luther was twisting his father's arm or not. It does seem to be the case that Luther does make this vow in earnest, because just a month later, July 17th, Luther has a dinner party with his friends, and it's sort of a farewell party. And at the end of it, they walk Luther to the gate of the Augustinian observant order there in the city of Erfurt. And Luther says to them, "Today you see me, but tomorrow no more." And he enters the monastery there. Now, what's in play here? Why is Luther joining the monastery? What would it have been like to be a monk, and what were the assumptions here? Well, first and foremost, to become a monk is not seen as saving oneself and leaving a secular world as we might say it today. A monk is not seen as someone who is saved, whereas someone who's a lawyer is someone who's in the secular world and therefore unsaved. You could be a good Catholic and be a lawyer or a copper miner or any of these things. Rather, a monk is, you might say, someone who is taking the Christian life more seriously. And it's not that they believe, again, that they're better than other people, but rather becoming a monk fits hand in glove with the way that the medieval world viewed the Christian life. And that is that salvation, while begun and enacted by the Spirit and by God's predestination, was believed in the Catholic system to also require a lifetime of penance and good works to, you might say, polish the gem that had been entrusted to the person in their baptism. The Catholic life goes something like this. You are born, and then within 7 days, you are baptized. Often people would get their name, in fact, from their christening date. Martin Luther himself was named Martin because he was baptized on the feast of St. Martin. So you would be christened, and the belief in the Catholic system is that at your baptism, original sin is wiped away, the Holy Spirit comes into the infant, and the infant then enters into something that we call the state of grace. The state of grace is not a slippery term, but it's sometimes hard to understand if you're not used to this language. I often say that the state of grace is, to use maybe a bad analogy, like the car coming out of the car wash. Perfectly clean. as clean as it's going to be. Relatively speaking, of course, in terms of the car, but perfectly so when referring to the human soul after baptism. It is as clean and pure as possible. Well, the Catholic system does believe that you go on sinning. Though original sin is wiped away and the original stain is wiped away, the belief is that sin corrupts or taints or ruins, maybe to a small degree, maybe to a large degree, depending on the sin, the state of the purity of the state of grace in that person. To use the car analogy, you drive through a mud patch and splash the car and get it dirty again. Well, in the Catholic system, the goal of the Christian life is not so much to save oneself in the ultimate sense, but rather to take care of the ongoing effects of sin in the Christian life. In other words, the Catholic system, in a very specific sense, believes that salvation is a gift because it comes first and foremost in baptism. The infant has done no good works by the age of 7 days, and there is no righteousness in that infant. And therefore, they maintain what they believe is the Augustinian priority of grace. Grace comes in. They then say, though, that the rest of the Christian life is the working out of one's salvation in the sense of paying back the debt for each of these sins as the Christian life carries on. And so one sins, and the way you deal with sin is you confess it first of all, and you confess it always, always, always to a priest. Private confession to Christ alone in prayer, or simply to another layperson, is not enough. It's insufficient. You must go to the church, and you must go to the representative of Christ within the church, which in this case would be a priest. When you confess your sins, and the priest says you are absolved, which is a way of saying that you are forgiven. You will not be tossed out of the church and thrown into hellfire and damnation. However, following on from that, the priest will assign a number of penances for the sins that one has committed. And penance can be any number of things. It can be Hail Marys, it could be Our Fathers, it could be giving of alms to the church, which an alm is anything above and beyond your tithe, which was required. It can be to go on pilgrimage. It could be to attend Mass and take part in the sacraments. Any number of these things could be assigned. And the idea here is that you're supposed to purge and wash away the dirt of the sin that you have committed. And it was also at times described as a bit like exercise. You would exercise through these acts of good works to strengthen the soul so that the next time sin presents itself, you don't succumb to the pressure. And with the penance having been completed and finished, you are then returned. Now, you don't feel this and you don't experience this personally, but you are guaranteed to have been returned to the state of grace. Now, what happens if you don't complete all of the penance, or you don't confess all of the sins in your life? Well, that's where purgatory comes in. I always tell students purgatory goes up, not down. Purgatory is not pre-hell or another word for hell. Purgatory, rather, is the final penance. It's the penance one does at the end of their life on the way up to the final beatific vision where we see Christ in heaven. So this is the Christian life. It's begun by grace, and then there is this cycle of sin, confession, penance, sin, confession, penance. The goal of the Christian life, then, is to continue to work yourself back into the state of grace. Now, here's where the monastic life comes in. If the goal of the Christian, of all Catholics, is to confess and perform penance, well, then it stands to reason that those who are engaging in a life that is constantly working out penance and confession are achieving more in terms of washing away the dirt of sin in their Christian life than those who, say, confess once a year, which was all that was required of lay persons within the Catholic system. Once a year. Usually on Easter, you confess, and as you can imagine, you can't confess an entire year's worth of sins, much less remember them all. And so the lay person is believed to be stacking up all kinds of penances and all kinds of things that will be washed away in purgatory. The monk, though, is living more on that edge. They're trying to achieve a life of sanctification and godly living. And they're doing this through constant devotion and prayer and etc. So what does Luther believe he's doing when he joins the monastery? Well, put simply, he believes he's joining the higher life, the life of constant devotion and merit and penance. He doesn't believe he's going to save himself per se, at least not yet, but he does believe that there is something in his life that requires a certain severity, a certain radical commitment to the life of the monastery. Now, if there's any weakness in late medieval Catholicism on the doctrine of salvation, it's that it wasn't quite clear, and it wasn't expressed as clearly as it maybe could have been, whether or not someone could lose their salvation fully if they didn't perform enough penance, or, more importantly, and this will be very important for Luther, if they didn't perform penance self-consciously with real conviction. In other words, there was an ambiguity in the latter Middle Ages for Luther as to whether or not his penance was good enough. And because there was a lack of clarity as to whether or not his penance was good enough, there was also a lack of clarity as to whether or not a person living their life not performing penance in the appropriate way would eventually be cast out and have so corrupted and corroded themselves that they do end up losing, you might say, their salvation. Now, this is an important point because Luther does not fundamentally believe that he's in the monastery again to save himself, but rather, you might say, he believes he's in the monastery attempting to make sure that he doesn't lose himself, which is sort of the inverse of the idea of performing works for salvation. Rather, what he's trying to do is perform works to maintain the free grace of salvation that he is said to have received at baptism. In other words, the late medieval system was a in by grace, remain in by works system. It is not the case, and Protestants really need to know this, it is not the case that the Catholic system is a pure works righteousness system. They believe that at baptism, the infant receives nothing but grace, nothing but the good grace of God that is infused into their hearts. The works of the Christian life then are said to be a result of that, but what was ambiguous, at least by the time Luther joined the monastery, is what happens if you do not perform your penance well enough, and what happens if you do not perform enough. Do you lose your salvation? So Luther's life as a monk was full of ups and downs, highs and lows, but we do know from his own words later that it was a bit of a torturous experience. Now, Luther wasn't always being tortured. He was actually, in terms of his career, in terms of his education, rapidly advancing up the ranks. In 1512, for example, he received a doctorate, and he is eventually installed as a professor of theology and Bible at the University of Wittenberg, this new startup university out in the eastern part of Germany. And it was there at Wittenberg where Luther will essentially live for the rest of his life. Luther is also being moved up the ranks in terms of his monastic order. He's being given opportunity for leadership. But there is something fundamental, Luther tells us, in his heart, where he's not comfortable with the Christian life as he's living it. And he gives us a word for this. He calls it Anfechtungen. And Anfechtungen is a word that's hard to translate into modern English. It has a number of elements within it: crisis, anxiety, anger, depression, fear, etc. What Luther tells us is he has this Anfechtungen. He has all of these complex emotions in his life, and he does not believe fundamentally that he is living up to the standard of the monastic life that was held before him. Luther had a mentor all throughout his days, first in Erfurt and then in Wittenberg. And the man was named Johann Staupitz. Staupitz is the older brother and the father figure for Luther in the monastery. Staupitz continually points Luther to Christ, and as Luther's confessor, it was to Staupitz that Luther constantly came to confess everything that was upon his heart and on his mind. And Luther tells us all kinds of stories about this. In one case, he has a marathon session with Staupitz, and on the way back to his cell, he remembers some more sins that he needed to confess, and so he races back to confess those as well. What seems to have Luther locked up here is not so much that he takes his own sin seriously. Lots of Catholics took their sin seriously. What's locking Luther up more than anything else, and he tells us this later, is that he has no conviction that his heart is in the right place. You have to not simply be fearful of purgatory or damnation to confess your sins. Rather, Luther was told, and this was standard for the day, you have to actually legitimately be sorry for your sins as an affront to God. Anything short of that is not true confession. And so Luther cannot come to the fundamental conviction that he has done this with any sincerity and conviction. He always knows that his heart and his will are mingled with sin, and therefore sometimes he is just fearful. He doesn't feel bad for his sins. And so Luther's life, to go back to this idea of the cycle of sin, confession, and penance, and returning to the state of grace, is that this loop for Luther so seized him up because he believed that fundamentally he was falling further away from the state of grace, and that here he was in a life as a monk, and he had joined not just any old monastery, he had joined an observant monastery, which is one of the most important revival groups within the monastic orders that really took monastic life seriously. He wasn't in a lazy monastery, he was in a very serious one, and he was taking it very seriously in that monastery. And yet Luther still believed, fundamentally, that he was unable to achieve any serious conviction for his sin, and he felt that his penance was insufficient. Well, all of this comes to a head for Luther sometime around 1515, maybe 1516. Some historians date it earlier, 1513 maybe. We really don't know. Luther gives us the what happened of this story, but he never gives us the when of this story. But sometime around, let's say around number of 1515, sometime around 1515, Luther has what we call today his breakthrough. And his breakthrough is really a fundamental rereading of what the gospel message is all about. And the breakthrough Luther describes as his Turmerlebnis, which is translated to mean his tower experience. Now, one little myth here. The Turmerlebnis is too often believed to be Luther sitting upon the toilet. Yes, on the toilet. Don't believe me? There was actually a play in the 1960s and 70s called Luther. A lot of famous people were in this play, and it had a good run for a while. Well, the play really culminates with Luther having a bowel movement on the toilet there at the end. Again, a lot of this comes from Erik Erikson and the Freudian side of the interpretation of Luther. It is alleged that Luther's spiritual crisis manifested itself physically in constipation, and therefore the Turmerlebnis was, let's just say, relief from this constipation. And there's all kinds of myths here. It's not what happened, frankly. And historians have exploded this repeatedly. It was injected into historical interpretation by people who were not historians but were psychologists, and they got the history wrong. Luther does describe his bodily functions, let's just put it that way, quite often, both before his Reformation breakthrough and after, but that just means he's a bit scatological. He's not really describing his Reformation breakthrough itself as being literally upon the toilet. No, the Turmerlebnis, we're pretty certain, happened in the tower on the side of one of the great buildings there in the monastery of Wittenberg. Luther would have been in this tower because it would have been cold, and this was the warmest part of that area, and he was in there reading. He does tell us what he was reading, though. He was reading Romans, and he came to Romans 1:17, which says that a righteousness is revealed from above, from faith to faith, that the just shall live by faith. Now, Protestants are very familiar with this passage. We're very much used to seeing this as the heart of the gospel. That God has revealed a righteousness in the person of Christ, and it is by faith that you grab hold of Christ. Well, just to show how the interpretation of a passage can affect the way someone interprets the passage in the light of their Christian living. Luther tells us that the way he read this passage was entirely medieval. And what he means by that is he actually had a particular set of assumptions about what this passage meant in the context of the monastery. For Luther, he says, the passage was actually one that was quite scary. When he read the words that a righteousness from Christ is revealed, he tells us that what he interpreted that passage to mean was that God had given us a standard, a righteousness, that we had to live up to. It was not a righteousness that is in Christ, it is a righteousness that is more like the bar, the high jump bar, that the Christian is supposed to jump over. And even the words that the just shall live by faith was interpreted to mean that the just shall live by working out their faith in love through the context of sin, confession, penance, etc. So right there you can see that what we have here is something like a hermeneutical grid, or a way of understanding a passage in the light of the Middle Ages. Well, Luther's breakthrough in a simple way, just as simple as you want to put it, is that he comes to a reorientation of this passage as the heart of the gospel. And it's not just this passage, but this is the one he tells us about. The breakthrough for Luther is that as he reflects on it, and as he meditates on this passage, he eventually comes to the conclusion that the way that the medieval church was understanding righteousness as being tied up with merit and the good works of the Christian in their life was antithetical to what Paul was saying here. And he spins the passage around. Now he believes, after his breakthrough, after his Turm Erlebnis, that the righteousness is the righteousness of Christ himself. It's the righteous life that he lived as the covenant keeper, as the one who was pure. And, more importantly, living by faith is not living a life devoted to works unto oneself, even if they are inspired and nourished by the sacraments and by the Spirit. No, rather, Luther says, by faith means that we grab onto that righteousness of Christ, that we trust that it counts as our righteousness. Now, he will come eventually to call this the alien righteousness of Christ, which is just another way of saying it's a righteousness that's not ours. It's a righteousness that's external to us. It's Christ's righteousness. It belongs to him. But what Paul is saying here, Luther tells us, is that we grab that by believing that his life, by faith, counts as our good works, and that his death, by faith, counts as the death that we owed. And so Luther, again and again, says that the breakthrough was about the gospel itself. And this is important to grasp, because what we're going to look at in our next lecture is Luther's Reformation itself. What Luther does with this fundamental breakthrough. How does this breakthrough to a new understanding of Christ's righteousness and our faith in him and his work, how does that affect the ongoing fight with the Catholic Church? But it needs to be stressed right now, Luther's breakthrough in the fundamental core of his Reformation is about the gospel. It's not about church corruption. In fact, too often what happens is the story is told that the church was corrupt and Luther went and fought against the church. But that's not the core conviction here. Rather, the core conviction for Luther, when he has his breakthrough, when he's in that tower, when the gospel shines new light into his heart, that is the gas in the engine. That is what drives him for the remainder of his career. In fact, all of the challenges Luther has for the church and all the reforms that he eventually puts forward for the Lutheran church are driven by this commitment to the alien righteousness of Christ and through a life lived beneath the cross, not in anticipation that our works will accomplish anything for our life, but rather that Christ's work has paid it all, including the sins that are part of the ongoing Christian life. Rather, for Luther, it is the gospel breakthrough, the Reformation breakthrough, as we call it, that is the driver for everything he is about to do. And it's telling that he has his breakthrough at least a couple of years before he even posts the 95 Theses, and he begins to fight with Tetzel and the Catholic Church on the subject of indulgences. The gospel breakthrough has happened first, and it's that breakthrough, as we'll see in our next lecture, that drives him to reform the church.